All right, historians. Last time we were discussing the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War and why we decided to go to war in Vietnam, right? We wanted to stop the spread of communism. You got to see the Gulf of Tonkin incident and that type of stuff. And so now we're going to talk about how the actual war um, really goes on. And early on, with just about 23,000 troops stationed there, it really hadn't escalated yet. That's going to all change in 1964, 65. So here's Vietnam. It's going to be split in two, North and South, after Dien Bien Phu that we talked about. If you watch Vietnam movies, if you read about it, you're going to hear a lot about Saigon. It's in some different songs. We'll listen to Billy Joel's song, Goodnight Saigon. Saigon was the capital of South Vietnam. And then in the north, you had Hanoi. And Hanoi was the capital of North Vietnam. One of the guys you're going to hear a lot about is General William Westmoreland. And Westmoreland was in charge of the war in Vietnam. He was the guy that was in charge. He was just like Eisenhower was kind of in charge in Europe. You had MacArthur in charge during World War II in the Pacific. Well, William Westmoreland in the Vietnam War, the Vietnam War is going to be starting about 20 years after the end of the of World War II. So General William Westmoreland is the guy in charge. He's in charge of the troops. And he comes up with a plan that's a war of attrition. It was search and destroy, seek and destroy missions. It's not about taking over land in Vietnam. His goal was to basically just kill all of the enemy troops. And so body counts were a big thing. And they would let the newspapers know, today we killed 50 of the enemy. Today we killed 500 of the enemy. So body counts were big. So it was seek and destroy. They would drop the troops off in a helicopter. Troops would go on a search and destroy mission, and then the helicopter would pick them up somewhere else. So a little bit different style of war than what we were used to. You look at World War II, we're marching across Europe. We're taking the islands in the Pacific. The Korean War, we're trying to drive the North Korean communists back across the 38th parallel. Vietnam, they're just dropping them off, looking for the enemy, shooting them, and then picking them up. Operation Rolling Thunder was an idea that occurred after Lyndon Johnson was reelected as president in 1964. And in March of 1965, they decide to begin Operation Rolling Thunder. And remember, they're just putting troops in South Vietnam. The troops walking around are in South Vietnam fighting the Vietcong, fighting the Vietnamese Liberation Army, and they are only fighting in South Vietnam. So how do we take the attack to North Vietnam that is supplying the troops in South Vietnam? We're going to start bombing the heck out of them. And they call this Operation Rolling Thunder. In the end, we spent probably close to $1 billion or more dropping these bombs on North Vietnam. Over the course of the war, U.S. caused hundreds of millions of dollars of damage to farmland and the forests, trying to destroy the enemy. We're trying to destroy their economy. And sometimes they talk about like some of the shrapnel and stuff that came out of the bombs was plastic, because the idea was not necessarily to kill people in North Vietnam, but to injure them. If somebody's dead, you bury them right away and you're done. If somebody's injured, people have to take care of them. And so they were looking to destroy the economy in that way. So the bombing objectives: destroy the North Vietnamese economy, hinder the flow of supplies and men. North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, they were sending weapons and they were sending food and they were sending people, whatever, down into South Vietnam for the war effort. The bombing objectives: to reduce morale and the will to fight. all these objectives failed. There's a lot of studies that have been done, and they think that actually we hurt our economy more than we hurt the North Vietnamese economy. Basically, we spent $10 for every $1 that the North Vietnamese economy lost or we destroyed. We spent $10 for each one. So $100 for every $10, $1,000 for every 100, and so on. So these objectives failed. So who are we fighting? Well, mostly we're fighting the Vietcong. These are the South Vietnamese rebels that are fighting against the South Vietnamese government. They're rebelling, trying to overthrow it. We're there to make sure that that government stays in charge. What are they going to replace that government with if they win? They're going to replace it with communism. We don't want that to happen. The Vietminh are the North Vietnamese army, and they would send troops and supplies down to assist the Vietcong. So a lot of times we're fighting the Vietcong, but it's a mixture of the South Vietnamese rebels and the North Vietnamese, and they just want to combine and have one Vietnam. That's their goal. If you watch movies or read books or articles, you'll hear the term Charlie used. Charlie was the U.S. slang for enemy soldiers. So anybody that they're fighting and looking for, they'll refer to Charlie. The Ho Chi Minh Trail that we'll talk about, this was what they were using to supply the South Vietnamese rebels, the Vietcong, with weapons and food and supplies, whatever they needed. So they went across the border here, that was being patrolled. What they would do is they would go into Cambodia and Laos. And from Cambodia and Laos, they're not going to be attacked, and then they can slip in at different places. So that was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So weapons, including anti-aircraft artillery, were coming from the USSR. So a lot of times what you saw is maybe the USSR was flying and dropping stuff in here in North Korea, or China was also dropping stuff in North Korea, and then it would get brought down by the Vietminh and given to the Vietcong in South Vietnam. I might have said North Korea. I meant North Vietnam. Stuff that could blow our airplanes out of the air, blow helicopters out of the air. You're looking at AK-47s, assault rifles, machine guns. So here's Ho Chi Minh. He's saying, hey, you guys need soldiers and guns? No problem. I've got plenty. I'll send them down to the Vietcong. Here's the premier of the Soviet Union. He says, hey, I got your back. I'll send whatever you need, Ho Chi Minh. Mao Zedong, leader of China. So we're looking at these three leaders working together. What do they really care about? Spreading communism, but also basically being a pain to the United States of America. We're going to do the exact same thing in the 1980s in Afghanistan, supplying the Afghanis with weapons to fight the Russians. Napalm was something that we also used to bomb North Vietnam and also places in South Vietnam. It was a liquid substance that would burn up to 10 minutes. So it's a chemical, and it apparently had a certain type of smell. But napalm and just the burning, it could really burn through an area of forest. Here's some napalm bombs. Those are big bombs right there. Just that fire just burning. This is an iconic photograph. You have the clothes burned right off that kid. So this was something that made it back to the U.S. newspapers, a world-famous Vietnam photograph. Robert McNamara was Secretary of Defense. He had been Secretary of Defense under JFK and then LBJ. So Robert McNamara was kind of one of the guys in charge of the war. He had been a smart guy, and he had worked for Ford and other companies. But one of the things that JFK tried to do right away when he took over as president was build a cabinet around himself full of some of the smartest people in the country. That was his goal. And then LBJ kind of had the same. So one of the things Robert McNamara kept saying is, we need to increase the amount of troops in Vietnam. We need to keep sending them over there. And he expected deaths of up to 1,000 troops a month at one point. And so he's making the decision like, yeah, we're going to lose troops. By the end of 1965, the United States had over 180,000 troops in Vietnam. The Vietcong controlled the countryside, and the U.S. kind of controlled the cities. And so when you went out into the countryside, that's where the Vietcong was at. That's where the patrols were at. McNamara warns that the North Vietnamese believe that time is on their side. They need to hold out long enough for the U.S. to leave. It's a war of attrition. And basically the Vietcong are saying, we're going to fight forever. North Vietnam saying, we'll fight forever. This is our home. We're not going to give up. Now, in the countryside, it could be hard to find these guys, hard to find the Vietcong. This is a jungle, tropical rainforest. And so one of the ways that they try to destroy the hiding spots is by killing the rainforest. They would drop herbicides down to kill the plants. The most famous of these herbicides is known as Agent Orange. It was a chemical sprayed on the forest to kill plants and make it hard for the Vietcong to hide. Problem is it caused a lot of birth defects like, what was it? I can't remember, spina bifida or something like that, and other things in the people. A lot of troops that have come back, people have developed cancer or died of cancer over the years and can kind of maybe trace that back to working with Agent Orange. Most of the and they got the name Agent Orange, not always because the barrels were orange, because it would have like an orange stripe on it. So that's how it got the name Agent Orange. So it just kill the forest. It's like if you spray, herbicide on your dandelions, it kills the dandelions. So you look at the amount of troops going up here. Well, by 1965, we have 180,000. By 1966, we have 400,000. By 1967, we have 500,000. By after 1968, we're over 500,000. Now, why was it difficult? Because our technology was way better than what the Vietnamese had. And so they were using what became known as guerrilla warfare. Small groups that use ambushes, hit and run tactics. They're going to use booby traps, things like that, landmines, to fight a larger and less mobile military. We were big. We had the planes. We had the helicopters. They knew the land. Hit and run. Boom, boom, boom. Get out of there. It was very frustrating. Head to head in a traditional war, we would destroy them. But they were using a tactic. Even though they might have a lot of people die using it, different tactics, they were there for the long run. So our strategy was to use superior power, superior technology, force the enemy to surrender, use airstrikes and bomb the enemy into submission, search and destroy missions to pinpoint enemy bases and supplies, set up blockades to prevent supplies from reaching our enemy. The North Vietnamese, their goal is just wear the U.S. down, rely on that guerrilla tactics of surprise and mobility, avoid major head-to-head battles. They don't want to fight us head-to-head, hit and run. They knew the land. They had their tunnel systems. They wanted to fight at night and use underground tunnels to confuse us. They're not going to fight to win, and they're not going to give a big knockout punch, but they want to prolong the war and never lose it. Problems with fighting in the jungle, it could be 100 plus degrees, 100% humidity. That's where you walk outside on one of the hottest days in the summer. You're not really sweating, but when the humidity in the air touches your skin, even though our skin might be 98.6 degrees or our body temperature is, when that air hits us, we're colder than the air and it turns to water right away. There were leeches, there were snakes, mosquitoes and malaria, all sorts of diseases. muddy. It's raining all the time. You might remember, like, if you've seen Forrest Gump, he talks about how one day it just started to rain, and it rained, and it rained, and he talks about all the different types of rain. The other issue was they didn't know who their enemy was. You might go into a village and they seem friendly, but are they your enemy or are they on your side? A lot of people basically didn't, they weren't on any side. The enemy might live amongst friends, and you didn't know who was your enemy and who was your friend. Here's the kind of tunnel systems that they built. And they could kind of move around, and one of the jobs was to look for these tunnels. I'll have a link to this song later. 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara appears before Congress, and he tells them that the bombings in North Vietnam have been unsuccessful, and supplies continue to enter Vietnam. The American public is hearing nothing but success stories. Everything is a success. The Johnson administration that was in charge of the war effort from 64 to 68, the U.S. government and General Westmoreland state that they're winning the war. That's all the American people heard from Westmoreland, from Lyndon Johnson. We are winning the war. Things changed in 1968. As Americans are hearing that the war is almost over, we're about to win, and everybody's kind of thinking, okay, that's good. It's been a long war. The Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive. A New Year's holiday, Tet, is a Vietnamese holiday, and they were supposed to kind of be like, okay, there's not going to be any fighting because it's the holiday. It's the Tet Offensive or Tet holiday. Well, they launch an offensive attack. The Vietcong and the Vietminh, the South or the Vietnamese Liberation Army, launches an attack on this holiday, and they attack every U.S. military base, and every major city in South Vietnam is attacked on the same day. And it fails in regards to they aren't able to take any military bases, they aren't able to take any of these towns, but the American people are going, wait a second, we were told this thing was almost over with, and now they launch this big attack? That doesn't sound like it's almost over with. North Vietnam loses 37,000 troops in the Tet Offensive. The U.S. loses 2,500. Another iconic photograph. This was a South Vietnamese military officer shooting a spy or somebody that was supporting the Vietminh, Vietcong. So anytime you see a movie or video clips where the fighting's going on in cities, that was the Tet Offensive. Full Metal Jacket, it's rated R, so I'm guessing most of you haven't seen it, but the end of the movie, the second half of the movie, is about the Tet Offensive. Then the last thing we'll kind of pick up here next time, but this is the My Lai massacre of 1968, where American soldiers massacre hundreds of civilians in a village, mostly women, children, the elderly, and it's in South Vietnam, and it's kind of covered up what happens there. And this is going to be a big story later on. And so that's a little bit of the jungle warfare and the first part of the war, what was happening.